Daniel Cross grabbed Richard Vale by the collar and slammed him against the wall so hard, the framed company portrait crashed to the floor. "You put 23 people in that building to die," Daniel said, "and you used me to do it." Vale didn't flinch. He smiled the slow, satisfied smile of a man who believed he was still in control. "You're a janitor, Daniel." He straightened his tie even with Daniel's fist at his throat. "Who's going to believe a janitor?" Daniel leaned in close. "Ask your guards." His voice was barely above a whisper. "The ones who spent the last 3 hours following my orders because yours got people killed." The smile disappeared. And for the first time that night, the first time in 3.5 years, Richard Vale looked at the man he'd hired to mop his floors and saw something that made his chest go cold. He saw someone who had already won. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe and stay with me. This one goes all the way to the end. The elevator doors opened on the 32nd floor at exactly 11:14 p.m., and Daniel Cross stepped out, pushing a gray cleaning cart with a broken left wheel that squeaked every 4 rotations. Squeak, 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 clunk, squeak, 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 clunk. He had reported the broken wheel 3 times through the building maintenance portal. Nobody had fixed it. He'd stopped caring about that 6 months ago. The cart still moved. That was enough. Daniel was 44 years old. Though most people who bothered to look at him guessed older, there were lines around his eyes that hadn't come from laughter. His hands were large and calloused in ways that didn't quite match a man who spent his nights pushing mops. His posture, even in a gray janitor's uniform, was the kind you didn't get from years of cleaning floors. It was the kind you got from years of carrying weight that wasn't physical. He never talked about that. He never talked about much of anything, really. That was part of the job. You show up, you clean, you disappear, you go home before sunrise, make your daughter's lunch for the next day, sleep 4 hours on a good night, and do it all again. Tonight was Tuesday, which meant the executive floor, which meant the glass-walled conference rooms needed to be wiped down the recycling bins, emptied the carpet run over with the industrial vacuum that he'd learned to operate on the lowest setting, so it didn't disturb the security team doing their rounds. Daniel had learned every rhythm of this building the same way he'd once learned enemy patrol patterns in terrain that didn't belong to him, quietly, carefully, without anyone knowing he was paying attention. He rounded the corner past the security station near the east stairwell and gave a short nod to Marcus Webb, the overnight guard who'd been posted on 32 for the past 8 months. Marcus didn't nod back. I was looking at his phone. He never looked up when Daniel passed. That was fine. Daniel kept moving. The executive floor of Sterling Horizon Technologies occupied the top 4 levels of the building floors, 31 through 34, and it was the kind of space that made ordinary people feel immediately aware of their own smallness. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Furniture that cost more than most people's cars. Art on the walls that nobody was allowed to touch. Daniel had touched all of it. Not like that. Just he cleaned around it. He learned which frames were slightly crooked and which ones the cleaning crew before him had scuffed. He knew which desk drawers were always left slightly open, which coffee mugs were left unwashed, in which offices, which executives worked late, and which ones just looked like they worked late. He knew this building the way you only know a place when you've been invisible inside it for years. 3.5 years to be exact. He'd taken the job at Sterling Horizon 11 days after he moved his daughter Lily to a 2-bedroom apartment in Queens. She was 6 years old then. She was 9 now. She still slept with the lights on, and Daniel still checked on her twice every night before he left for work, pulling her blanket up to her chin and standing in the doorway for longer than he meant to. He told himself it was just habit. He knew it was something else. At 11:31 p.m. Daniel was cleaning the glass partition outside conference room 34A when he heard voices on the other side that he wasn't supposed to hear. He wasn't eavesdropping. He was just doing his job. But the ventilation system in the executive corridor had a quirk he'd noticed 8 months ago. Sound traveled through it in ways the architects hadn't intended. Certain conversations from inside 34A came through the wall like someone had cracked a window. Tonight he heard a voice he recognized immediately. Richard Vale, Chief Operating Officer. The second most powerful person in Sterling Horizon Technologies. A man who wore his suits the way other men wore armor, and who spoke in the flat measured tones of someone who had never in his life been told no and meant it. She presents the evidence at Thursday's board session, and everything we've built comes apart. Vale's voice. Low. Controlled. But with something beneath it that Daniel had learned to recognize the sound of a man who had already made a decision and was now just narrating it to others. A second voice Daniel didn't recognize. The board members aren't going to. The board members, Vale interrupted, will react the way people always react when they're frightened. They'll look for someone to blame, and we need to make sure they're looking in the wrong direction before Thursday. Silence. Then the second voice again, quieter. What about the footage she has access to? She won't have access to anything, Vale said, if she can't get to Thursday. Daniel's hand stopped moving on the glass. He stood very still. If she can't get to Thursday. He'd worked in enough situations where words like that meant something specific. Where can't get to Thursday wasn't a negotiating tactic or a legal maneuver. Where it was exactly what it sounded like. He waited. He listened. But the ventilation shifted and the voices dropped below the threshold, and all he caught after that were fragments. A number. Something that sounded like a company name he didn't recognize. And then Richard Vale saying with the casual ease of a man ordering dinner, "Make sure Harmon has the layout by tomorrow morning." The meeting ended 12 minutes later. Daniel finished the glass partition. He moved to the next window. He did not let his hands shake. She. He knew who she was. Everybody in the building knew who she was. Victoria Sterling was 38 years old, and she had built Sterling Horizon Technologies from a startup she'd founded in her late 20s into one of the most valuable technology companies on the Eastern Seaboard. She was the youngest woman to ever appear on the cover of Forbes twice in the same decade. She had a reputation for being brilliant, demanding, and almost pathologically private. She also worked late. Daniel knew this because he cleaned her office every Tuesday and Thursday, and on both nights, he was rarely the last one on the floor. More often than not, he'd finish the room and push his cart back toward the service corridor, only to hear her elevator arrive an hour later, sometimes two. She never acknowledged him, not once in 3.5 years. Not rudely. She simply looked through him, the way very powerful people look through the infrastructure that keeps their world functioning. You don't think about the walls when you're planning the future. He never took it personally. He'd spent years being invisible. It was in its own way a skill. At 12:18 a.m. Daniel was on the 31st floor near the server room access corridor when he noticed something that stopped him cold. The maintenance panel on the east wall. The one that controlled the building's secondary emergency door system was open. Not broken open, not vandalized. Open. Carefully. Deliberately. The panel cover was resting against the wall at an angle that said someone had placed it there, not dropped it. The wiring inside had been accessed. 3 specific relay modules Daniel could see from where he stood had been physically bypassed. He knew what those relays controlled. He'd read the building's maintenance manual, the same month he started working here, the same way he'd read every technical document related to every environment he'd ever operated in. Those relays were the trigger mechanism for the emergency door locks on floors 28 through 34. In any declared building emergency, those doors were supposed to seal automatically and direct occupants toward 2 specific evacuation corridors. If those relays were bypassed, the doors wouldn't seal, which meant in an emergency, people would go toward those corridors anyway, and the corridors could be controlled. He took out his phone and photographed the panel. Then he photographed the wiring. Then he replaced the panel cover exactly as he'd found it, slightly angled, resting against the wall, and kept walking. His face didn't change. His pace didn't change. But something inside him that had been dormant for years shifted position. Like a sleeping thing that had just heard a sound it recognized. He found the second tampered panel at 12:44 a.m. in the mechanical room on the 33rd floor. This one was more sophisticated. Whoever had done it knew exactly what they were touching. The building's communication network, the internal system that connected security stations, the front desk, the emergency management console, and the rooftop relay had been accessed and partially rerouted. Not destroyed. Rerouted. It was a clean job. The kind of job that didn't announce itself. The kind of job that waited. Daniel stood in that mechanical room for 90 seconds, looking at the wiring, feeling something cold and familiar settle into the space between his shoulders. He'd seen preparation like this before. He knew what preparation like this meant. It meant Thursday wasn't actually the threat. It meant the threat was coming sooner. He spent the rest of the shift working normally, cleaning, moving, saying nothing. He signed out at 3:40 a.m., took the subway home, stood in his daughter's doorway for 4 minutes while she slept with her nightlight on and one arm hanging off the edge of the mattress, the way she always slept. Then he sat at his kitchen table and stared at the photographs on his phone for a long time. He thought about calling someone. He thought about who that would even be. There was no one in his life from the before time who would take a call from Daniel Cross without asking questions he couldn't answer. There was no agency, no team, no one who owed him anything or trusted anything he might say. He was a janitor, a middle-aged man who pushed a broken cart through office hallways at midnight. Who was going to listen to him? Shared. By Wednesday evening, he'd made his decision. Not to do anything dramatic, not to play hero, just to be in the building, pay attention, and be ready. Because 32 years of life experience, most of it in places and situations he never talked about, had taught him one thing above everything else. When someone has gone to that much trouble to make a trap invisible, they are counting on nobody seeing it until it's too late. He'd spent his whole life seeing things other people didn't. I wasn't going to pretend he hadn't seen this. He arrived for his Wednesday night shift 20 minutes early, which he never did. Nobody noticed. He signed in, collected his cart, the one with the broken left wheel, and went directly to the 31st floor via the service elevator, which he only used when he was moving heavy equipment, but which he chose tonight because it bypassed every security checkpoint on the main elevator banks. His radio was on. Standard issue building maintenance channel. He'd requested one of the older models, an analog unit that ran on a frequency. The building's digital security system didn't automatically monitor 8 months ago, citing a personal preference for clearer signal in the mechanical rooms. The request had been approved by a facilities manager who hadn't looked up from her desk. He carried it with him every shift. Tonight, he checked the battery twice. At 9:12 p.m., the building's fire suppression sensor on the 28th floor registered a heat spike and then went silent. At 9:14 p.m., Daniel heard the first explosion. It wasn't large, it wasn't theatrical. It was the kind of controlled, precise detonation that someone who knew what they were doing produced when they wanted to knock out a structural support without bringing down an entire floor. A professional sound. Contained. But Daniel knew that sound. His body knew it before his mind caught up. He was already moving before the building's emergency alarm system attempted to trigger and then very visibly failed to trigger. The alarm sounded for 4 seconds, a truncated wail, and then cut out entirely. Because of course it did. Because the communication network had been rerouted. He grabbed his radio, moved to the service stairwell access door on 32 and opened it. From below, he could hear voices. Controlled, purposeful movement. People who knew where they were going. From the executive corridor above him, he could hear something else. Panic. The security team on 34 responded the way they were trained to respond. They moved immediately toward the primary evacuation corridor on the north side of the building surrounding Victoria Sterling, with 4 agents in a tight protective formation and pushing her toward the stairwell at a pace that didn't leave room for questions. Daniel knew that corridor. He also knew what had happened to the emergency door relays. I took the service stairs up 2 flights in 45 seconds of speed that would have surprised every person in that building who thought they knew anything about the man with the cleaning cart, and came through the access door into the 34th floor corridor directly ahead of the security formation. The lead agent, a man named Hargrove Tall, with the close-cropped certainty of someone who had been told his whole career that he was the most qualified person in any room, physically stepped in front of Daniel with one hand raised. "Service staff uses the east stairs," Hargrove said. Not a question, a command. The tone of a man who had never had it argued. "The north corridor is a trap," Daniel said. Flat. Calm. Not a performance. Just a statement. Hargrove looked at him the way people look at a foreign object in a familiar space. "Get back to the Gindi. The emergency door relays on 28 through 34 have been manually bypassed," Daniel said, keeping his voice at the same level. "Your evacuation corridor leads to a choke point. Someone is waiting there. If you move her through that stairwell, you will not have a second chance." A beat of silence. The four agents looked at each other. Victoria Sterling, standing in the center of the formation, looked at Daniel for the first time in 3.5 years. Really looked at him. He watched her eyes do what intelligent people's eyes do when they're processing something that doesn't fit their existing categories. She wasn't dismissing him. She was calculating. "Who are you?" she said. "Daniel Cross. I clean your office on Tuesday and Thursday nights." Something moved through her expression. Not recognition exactly. More like the feeling of something snapping into place that had been slightly misaligned. "You're telling me?" "I'm telling you, I've been through this building every night for 3.5 years, and I know what I saw in those maintenance panels, and your north corridor is not safe." He looked at Hargrove. "Test it if you want. Send one man ahead. Give him 30 seconds. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He looked at the woman he was paid to protect. She looked at the janitor. "Check it," she said quietly. The agent. Hargrove sent ahead. A young man named Reyes, efficient, quick on his feet, made it 40 feet into the north stairwell before he came back at a dead sprint. "Blocked," he said, breathing harder than he wanted to. "2 levels down. And I heard—" He stopped, looked at Hargrove. "There are people down there, not ours." The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then Hargrove looked at Daniel Cross, and for the first time in 3.5 years, someone in that building looked at him as though he might have something worth following. "Okay," Hargrove said. He didn't apologize. Men like Hargrove rarely did. But he stepped back. He made space. "What do you know?" Daniel had already pulled a folded building schematic from the inside pocket of his janitor's jacket. He'd printed it from the maintenance manual portal 2 nights ago. He laid it on the floor. He pointed. "There's a service corridor on the south side of 33, he said. It runs parallel to the main structure between the HVAC system and the exterior wall. It's not on any evacuation map because the building code classifies it as a maintenance access route, not an emergency exit. But it connects to a freight elevator that runs directly to the loading dock on the first floor." He looked up. Nobody in this building knows about it except maintenance staff. Hargrove studied the schematic. His face did the thing faces do when professional pride is losing a quiet argument with practical necessity. "How confident are you?" he said. "Confident enough that I printed the map," Daniel said. Victoria Sterling bent down and looked at the schematic. Then she looked up at Daniel. "How long?" she said. "To get there?" 11 minutes if we move steadily," he said. "Less if we run. But running creates noise, and noise creates problems." She nodded once, the kind of nod that meant I've made a decision, and I'm not revisiting it. "Lead," she said. They moved through the service corridor in single file, Daniel at the front, then Victoria, then the 4 agents in staggered formation behind them. The corridor was narrow and warm and smelled of machine oil and concrete dust. Industrial lighting, every other fixture working. Overhead, the building's HVAC system ran at a constant low rumble that swallowed the sound of their footsteps. Daniel kept his pace measured. Not hurried, not hesitant. The same pace he used when he was carrying something heavy through an unfamiliar environment and needed to keep his footing. Victoria Sterling walked directly behind him without a word. He could hear her breathing controlled, deliberate, the breathing of someone who was frightened and was managing it professionally. He respected that. He'd worked alongside people half his age who couldn't manage their breathing when things went wrong. They were 40 feet into the corridor when his radio crackled. Static first. Then a voice one he didn't recognize speaking in clipped, precise syllables that had the cadence of someone running an operation. Service corridor on 33 is a secondary contingency. He said Cross might know about it. If you see anyone coming through maintenance access... The voice cut out. Daniel stopped walking. Victoria stopped behind him. "They know your name," she said quietly. Not an accusation. A statement. Precise and direct the way she talked in the executive meetings he'd heard fragments of through ventilation walls. "Yes," he said. "Which means this isn't random." "No," he said. "It isn't." She was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, "How do they know your name?" Daniel had been asking himself that question since the moment the voice on the radio said it. I thought he knew the answer. He didn't want to say it out loud yet. "I'll explain when we're out of the building," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, those clear, direct eyes doing their calculation, and then she nodded. "Move," she said. He moved. The freight elevator was where it was supposed to be. Daniel had checked it on his shift 3 weeks ago and again last night. The way he checked every exit, every access point, every structural detail he thought he might one day need. It was a habit that had never gone away, no matter how hard he'd tried to leave it behind. He pressed the call button. The elevator hummed upward. And then, from the stairwell access door, at the far end of the corridor, 60 feet behind them, came the sound of the handle being tested. One of the agents, Reyes, again moved to position near the door without being told. Hargrove moved up beside Daniel. "If this elevator doesn't work," Hargrove said low and even, "what's the secondary option?" Daniel pointed upward. "Roof access, 2 floors above us. There's a communications relay station. It's got independent power and a hardline connection that bypasses the building's internal network. I don't know if the hardline is intact, but it's the only communications point they couldn't have rerouted without physical access to the roof. And I checked the roof access log last week, and nobody's been up there in..." The elevator arrived. The doors opened. Daniel looked inside, checked the corners, checked the ceiling. Clean. "In," he said. They moved. The stairwell door handle rattled again, harder this time. Reyes held his position. The elevator doors closed. Daniel pressed the button for the loading dock level. The car began to descend. Hargrove let out a breath he'd been holding. One of the other agents, a woman named Castillo, who hadn't said a word the entire time, relaxed her shoulders by a fraction of an inch. Victoria Sterling looked at Daniel Cross in the close, functional light of the freight elevator. "You checked the roof access log," she said. "Yes." "Last week?" "Yes." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because when I saw the maintenance panels on Tuesday night," he said, "I started thinking about contingencies." She absorbed that. "You saw this coming," she said. "I saw the setup," he said. "I didn't know the timeline." "And you didn't report it." He held her gaze. "I reported it," he said. 3 months ago, I filed a maintenance concern through the facilities portal about the east wall panel on 31. Last month, I left a note in the security station on 32 about the communication relay in the mechanical room." Her expression shifted. "And the facilities request was closed as resolved," he said. "The security station note, I don't know. Nobody responded." Victoria looked at the floor of the elevator. Something moved through her face that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. Something more complicated than either. The look of a person who has just understood that a failure they didn't prevent was in some specific and painful way a failure they could have. "I'm sorry," she said. He hadn't expected that. He didn't know what to do with it, so he just nodded and looked at the floor numbers descending above the elevator door. 28, 8, 27, 26. Get. They were passing the 23rd floor when the elevator stopped. Not a controlled stop. Not a floor. A stop. The kind that meant someone had cut the power to the elevator shaft from an external panel. The car hung in the dark between 23 and 22. The emergency lighting, clicking on after a 2-second delay, casting everything in that flat battery-powered yellow that makes every face look exhausted and afraid. Victoria's agents immediately spread into defensive positions, which in an elevator meant 2 went to the doors and 2 moved to flank her. Professional response. Trained response. Hargrove looked at Daniel. "Options," he said. Daniel was already looking up. There was an emergency access hatch in the ceiling of the freight elevator. Standard in cargo elevators of this type and age. 18 inches by 24 inches. He knew it was there because he'd read the building's elevator maintenance specifications the same month he started. "Hatch," he said. "We go up. 23rd floor access panel is 2 feet above us on the north shaft wall." "You're sure?" Hargrove said. "I'm sure." Hargrove didn't hesitate this time. He looked at Castillo. "Boost him." She moved without argument, and Daniel for a moment registered the strangeness of a highly trained security professional crouching down to offer her knee as a step to a 44-year-old night janitor. He stepped up, pushed the hatch. It swung open. He pulled himself through in one movement, a movement that had too much muscle memory behind it for a man who was supposed to have spent the last decade pushing a cleaning cart. Nobody said anything about it. He reached down and helped the agents pull Victoria through. Then Castillo, then Reyes, then the others, and then last Hargrove, who gripped his wrist with the hard, calloused grip of a man who had spent years trusting his weight to other people's hands. They stood on top of the elevator car in the dark shaft, the building moving around them, and Daniel found the access panel exactly where he said it would be. He pried it open. They climbed through. They came out into a corridor on the 23rd floor, a floor that was at this hour empty and half-lit. Mid-level management offices. Nobody worked this late on 23. Daniel led them to the main stairwell on the south side and stopped at the door. He pressed his ear against it, listened for 15 seconds, then looked back. "Clear," he said, "but we're moving down 12 more floors and exiting through the loading dock access on the east side of the building, not the main dock." "I don't know if they've covered the main dock, and I don't want to find out." "Agreed," said Hargrove. They moved into the stairwell. And that was when Victoria Sterling, walking directly behind Daniel, said something quiet enough that only he could hear it. "Your name," she said. "They knew your name, and you knew this building like someone who was planning to survive it." He kept moving. "I told you," he said. "I've worked here 3.5 years." "Daniel," she said. He looked back at her over his shoulder. Her expression was not accusatory. It was not suspicious. It was the look of a woman who had built a company from nothing by understanding people, and who was applying that skill now in a stairwell in the dark, while the building moved around her in ways it shouldn't. "Who were you?" she said. He looked forward again. He didn't answer, but his hands, those large calloused hands that didn't quite match the job title on his building ID, tightened briefly on the railing as they descended, and the question hung in the stairwell behind them, like smoke after a fire. Who were you? The answer to that question was the one thing Daniel Cross had spent 9 years trying to leave behind. The one thing he had never in 3.5 years of mopping floors and pushing broken carts and standing in his daughter's doorway at 4 a.m. to make sure she was breathing, been able to fully bury. And tonight in this burning building, with this woman behind him and 12 floors of dark between them and the exit, he understood that the leaving was over. Whatever he had been before was still inside him. And the building knew his name, which meant someone had always known, which meant this had never been an accident, which meant the question, "Who were you?" was really asking something else entirely. Who did you used to be, that someone went to this much trouble to put you here in this building, cleaning these floors, waiting? He descended another flight, and he did not let himself think about the answer yet, because right now there were 12 floors between them and the exit, and 11 people whose lives depended on him watching the next corner. And Daniel Cross had not survived everything he had survived by thinking about things he couldn't change while there were still things in front of him to do. The stairs were dark below the 23rd floor. Not pitch black. There was emergency lighting, those flat battery-powered strips bolted to the wall every 2 floors, but dark enough that Daniel could only see 3 or 4 steps ahead of him at any given moment. Dark enough that the people behind him had to trust that he knew where he was putting his feet. They did. That was the part that still surprised him. 4 professional security agents, all of them trained, all of them armed, all of them with years of specialized protection experience, and every single one of them was following the man with the broken cleaning cart. Well, he didn't have the cart anymore. He'd left it on 32 when everything started. But they were still following him. That hadn't changed. He counted floors as they descended. 22, 21, 20. Victoria Sterling was directly behind him, close enough that he could hear her breathing. She'd gotten it under control somewhere around the 23rd floor. That careful, deliberate management of fear he'd noticed earlier, but he could still hear the effort in it. The slight tension at the top of each inhale. She was holding herself together with both hands, and she was doing it well, and he understood exactly what that cost. He'd done it himself once. For years, actually. Still did it some mornings when he woke up at 3 a.m. and the apartment was too quiet, and his brain decided to replay things he'd spent a decade trying to file away. 19. 18. Behind them, above them now, he heard it. A door opening. 2 floors up. The controlled, deliberate sound of people who knew how to move quietly, but were moving fast. "They're on 21, Castillo said from the back of the group. She hadn't needed to hear it twice. Closing. "How far to the loading dock?" Hargrove said, his voice right at Daniel's shoulder. 7 more floors, Daniel said. "But we're not going to the loading dock." "You said—" "I said east side exit. I changed my mind." Hargrove's jaw tightened. Daniel could feel it without looking. "Why?" "Because they expected us to go down," Daniel said. "Everything they've done tonight has been designed to push us downward. The north corridor blocked. The elevator stopped between 23 and 22. They're herding us toward the lower floors." He kept moving as he talked, his voice low and even. "That means whatever they have waiting is at the bottom." Silence for 2 steps. "So we go up," Victoria said. It wasn't a question. She'd already done the calculation herself. "We go up," Daniel said. Hargrove said nothing for a moment. Then, "That goes against every evacuation protocol I've ever—" "Your evacuation protocols," Daniel said, not unkindly, "are the reason they almost had her in the north corridor 40 minutes ago." Another silence. Longer this time. "Floor 26, Daniel said. "There's a sky bridge connecting this tower to the east annex. The annex has a separate entrance on the street's separate elevator system, and it runs on an independent power grid from a different utility provider. They'd have to have known about it and accessed it specifically, and if they did, we'll know before we're committed." They hit the landing on the 18th floor, and Daniel stopped, his hand flat against the stairwell door. He listened. 7 seconds of nothing but the building's mechanical systems running beneath them like a slow heartbeat. Then he pushed the door open 2 inches and looked through. Empty corridor. One of the flickering emergency lights at the far end. Nobody. He pulled it shut again. "We go back up," he said. Reyes, the youngest of the 4 agents, the one who'd gone ahead into the north corridor and come back at a dead sprint, spoke for only the 2nd time since this started. "You want us to climb 8 floors after coming down 5. "I want us to be alive," Daniel said. "Whether you do that while climbing or descending is up to you." Reyes looked at Hargrove. Hargrove looked at Daniel. Then he looked at the ceiling of the stairwell briefly, the way a man looks when he's making peace with something. "Up," he said. They went up. It was 11:58 p.m. Daniel knew this because he'd been checking his watch every few minutes since the first explosion. A habit, the same way he checked his daughter's room twice before leaving for work, the same way he tested every door handle twice before deciding it was locked. He'd learned a long time ago that time was the one resource you could never recover once you'd spent it, and knowing where you were in it was the difference between having options and not having any. They hit the 26th floor landing at 12:03 a.m., and Daniel paused at the door again. Same routine. Hand flat, ear close, 6 seconds. Then he heard something that made him go very still. A voice. Close. The other side of the door. One person speaking in the clipped half-sentences of someone receiving instructions through an earpiece. Confirmed on 23. Still looking for the secondary. Nothing on 26 yet, but... Daniel stepped back from the door. He held up one fist. Old signal. didn't even think about it, and every person behind him stopped moving immediately. Hargrove's eyes sharpened when he saw the signal. Something moved through his expression that Daniel didn't have time to examine. Daniel held up 2 fingers, pointed at the door, then pointed down the stairwell, then held up 1 finger and pointed at himself. Hargrove processed it in about a second and a half. He nodded. Daniel opened the door 6 inches. The man in the corridor was 20 feet away, facing the opposite direction, his back to the stairwell. Solid build. Dark jacket. No building ID visible. He had the posture of someone who'd done this kind of work before. Weight distributed, not standing at rest, but not quite at alert. The controlled readiness of a person waiting for a signal. Daniel stepped through the door, not slowly, not hesitantly. Fast and quiet the way you move, when the math says you have exactly 1 chance, and hesitation costs you the whole equation. He covered the 20 feet in about 3 seconds. He had the man's radio in one hand and his arm in a controlled hold before the man could process what was happening. The kind of hold that applied precise pressure to very specific points and communicated without any ambiguity at all that the person applying it knew exactly what they were doing and could escalate it to somewhere much more serious in about half a second. 1 sound, Daniel said quietly directly into the man's ear. And I end this conversation permanently. Nod if you understand. The man nodded. Daniel relieved him of his earpiece, his radio, and the sidearm he was carrying in a shoulder holster, all 3 in about 4 seconds, smooth and sequential. Nothing wasted. Then he used the man's own jacket to secure his hands and left him sitting against the wall with very clear instructions not to move, which the man showed every sign of following. He walked back to the stairwell door, opened it. The 4 agents and Victoria Sterling stared at him. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then, Reyes very quietly said, "What exactly were you before you were a janitor?" Daniel handed Hargrove the confiscated sidearm. "I'll explain later. The Sky Bridge is at the end of this corridor. We have maybe 4 minutes before someone checks in with our friend back there and doesn't get an answer." He looked at Victoria. She was looking at him differently now. Not with fear, not with confusion, with something more precise than either. The look of a person who has just updated a very significant assumption. 4 minutes, she said. Probably less, he said. Then move, she said. He moved. The Sky Bridge was 60 feet of enclosed walkway connecting the main tower to the east annex, glass-walled on both sides, running 26 floors above the street. Under normal circumstances, employees used it to move between buildings without going through security twice. Under normal circumstances, it was lit and climate-controlled and felt like walking through a corridor in any office building. Tonight, the lights on the bridge were off. The emergency strips provided just enough pale light to see the length of it, 60 feet of darkness ahead, the east annex on the other side, and beneath the glass floor panels, 26 floors of open air. Daniel stepped onto the bridge first. He didn't look down. He'd learned that a long time ago. You don't look at the things that can break your concentration. You look at where you're going, and you move. Howe was 20 feet onto the bridge when his new earpiece, the one he'd taken from the man in the corridor, crackled to life. A voice. Not the clipped half-sentences of a field operative. Smoother. Colder. The voice of a man who was used to being the last word in any conversation. Cross. Daniel stopped walking. Behind him, everyone stopped. He recognized the voice immediately. Of course he did. He'd heard it through a ventilation wall 48 hours ago, laying out the architecture of this entire night, with the casual precision of a man who had planned it so thoroughly that the outcome felt to him inevitable. Richard Vale. "I know you can hear me," Vale said. "I'm going to assume you've gotten this far by being smarter than my people expected, which I have to say is my fault. I told them you'd be a problem. They didn't believe me." A pause. "They believe me now." Daniel clicked the transmit button once. Didn't speak. Just let Vale know he was listening. "Here's what's going to happen," Vale said. "You're on the Sky Bridge right now. I know that because I have eyes on the East Annex approach, and you have nowhere else to go that makes sense from your position. So here's my offer. You leave her on the bridge. You walk through to the Annex, take the elevator down, and you walk out. Your daughter's name is Lily. She's 9 years old. She has school tomorrow. A beat. I'm not a monster, Daniel. I don't want her to grow up without a father. But I need you to make a decision in the next 60 seconds. The bridge was silent. Daniel could feel Victoria Sterling looking at the back of his head. He could feel Hargrove's hand shifting toward the weapon Daniel had just given him. He clicked transmit again. Lily wakes up at 6:15, Daniel said. She likes her eggs scrambled, not fried. She leaves her shoes in the middle of the doorway every single day, and I trip over them every single morning, and I have never once been able to stay angry about it. He paused. I know you think mentioning her is leverage. I need you to understand something. Every single thing I have done tonight, every door, every floor, every second I did because of her. Because she is 9 years old, and she already lost her mother, and I am not going to let her grow up in a world where a man like you gets to decide what happens to people. Silence on the line. Then Vale, and the smooth coldness in his voice had shifted just slightly, just enough to hear, said, That's very moving. It doesn't change. I'm not finished, Daniel said. You mentioned your eyes on the East Annex, which tells me you don't have people inside it yet, which means we have a window, and I'm going to use it. He released the transmit button, pulled the earpiece out, and looked back at the group. Fast, he said. Right now. They ran. All of them, even the agents who'd been trained to move tactically and conserve energy, they ran because Daniel's voice had the quality of someone who understood windows and what happened when you stood in one too long. They covered the remaining 40 feet of bridge in about 15 seconds and hit the East Annex door at the same time. It was locked. Card access lock, green LED, waiting for a credential. Daniel had anticipated this. He reached into the front pocket of his janitor's jacket, the same jacket he'd been wearing for the last several hours, the same one everyone had been ignoring for 3.5 years, and pulled out a magnetic keycard with a strip of blue tape on the back. Hargrove stared at it. Is that? The Annex facilities staff uses a different key system than the main tower, Daniel said, pressing the card to the reader. I have access because I covered 2 shifts here in January when they were short-staffed. The light went green. The door opened. Castillo actually exhaled out loud. They moved through into the East Annex. Different air, different smell, the particular quality of a building that's been sitting quiet all night without anyone in it. And Daniel moved immediately to the stairwell, bypassing the elevators entirely. Why not the elevator? Reyes said. Because Vale's people are going to figure out where we are in about 90 seconds, and the first thing they'll do is kill the elevators, Daniel said. We take the stairs to 3. There's a maintenance exit on the 3rd floor east side that opens onto a fire escape landing. It's not on any of the building's official exit maps because it was added during a renovation 3 years ago and never properly registered with the security system. The street below is a service alley. There's a laundromat on the corner that's open 24 hours. He said it all in one breath, moving as he talked, and nobody asked him how he knew any of it, because by this point they had stopped being surprised that he knew things and started simply being grateful. They hit the 3rd floor door at 12:19 a.m. Daniel pushed it open, moved through, and crossed to the east wall where the maintenance exit was a narrow metal door, no signage, a simple manual latch, and opened it. Cold air came in from outside. Street sounds. The distant sound of the city doing what the city always did. Indifferent and enormous, and completely unaware that 26 floors up in the building next door, a man who used to be something other than a janitor had just walked 11 people through an attack that was supposed to have no survivors. Hargrove went through, first checked the fire escape, looked down, looked up. Clear, he said. The agents began moving people through. Daniel was the last one out. He stood in the doorway for exactly 1 second, looking back through the annex toward the sky bridge, the dark glass of it, the empty corridor, the building that had been his whole world for 3.5 years. Then he stepped through. The door latched behind him. They descended the fire escape in single file, and when they hit the alley below, pavement, cold air, the smell of the city. Victoria Sterling turned to Daniel Cross and said the words with no preamble, no softening, the way she said everything. In the building, on the bridge, when Vale gave you the way out. She held his gaze. You didn't hesitate. No, he said. Most people would have. I know. Why didn't you? He looked at her for a moment. A woman who had built a billion-dollar company from nothing. A woman who had been betrayed by the person closest to her and had kept moving anyway. A woman who had spent the last 2 hours following a janitor through a burning building because she was smart enough to know when to update her assumptions. Because hesitation, he said, is just fear that hasn't made a decision yet. And I stopped letting fear make my decisions a long time ago. She looked at him for another moment. Who were you? She said. Same question. The one she'd asked in the stairwell, the one he hadn't answered. He looked at the alley around them. At Hargrove, who was already on his phone getting external backup coordinated. At Reyes, who was checking the perimeter with the focused energy of someone who needed to be doing something. At Castillo, who was standing quietly near Victoria, with the particular stillness of someone who'd processed everything and was now just waiting for the next instruction. 11 people. All of them breathing. All of them in the alley, and not in the building. He'd counted on the way down the fire escape. 11. There were 23 still in the building, he said quietly. Victoria went very still. You said that before, she said. When you up there before we got to the bridge, you said 23 people. I counted them, he said. On my way down from 32, I know which offices were occupied, which lights were on, which people were working late. I do the same floor every week. I know their habits. He looked at the building. 12 of them should have been able to reach the secondary stairwell on the south side of 29 on their own. I left the access door propped open before I came up to 34. The other 11 are above 27. The south stairwell doesn't reach above 28. Hargrove looked up from his phone. You're saying there are 11 people still trapped above 28? Yes. And you know exactly where they are. I know where they were as of 45 minutes ago, Daniel said. Whether they've moved? Daniel. Victoria's voice, quiet, direct, exactly the same tone she'd used when she said lead in the executive corridor 2 hours ago. What do we do? He looked at her. And this was the moment. He felt it, recognized it, the way you recognize a fork in a road you've driven before, where he could say, we wait for backup and be correct and reasonable and safe. Or he could say the other thing. The true thing. The thing that had been true since the moment he'd pulled himself through that elevator hatch and helped 11 people through a building that was trying to kill them. There's a secondary communications relay on the roof of the annex, he said. Independent power hardline connection. If it's intact, we can get a direct line to emergency services and give them the exact floor-by-floor layout of where the people are, where the attackers are, where the structural damage is everything. He paused. Emergency response coming in blind into that building is going to cost time and lives. Emergency response coming in with a complete picture, different outcome. The roof, Hargrove said, of the annex. That's where you want to go. That's where I'm going, Daniel said. You don't have to come. Hargrove looked at him for a long moment. Then he did something Daniel had not expected. He put out his hand. Not to stop him, not to redirect him, to shake his hand. Daniel looked at it for a second, then took it. I owe you an apology, Hargrove said. In the corridor, when you warned us about the north route. You were doing your job, Daniel said. I was doing my job badly, Hargrove said. There's a difference. He released his hand. I'm coming with you. Reyes Castillo, you stay with Ms. Sterling and coordinate with external backup when it arrives. He looked at Victoria. Ma'am. Victoria Sterling shook her head. I'm coming, she said. Every single person in the alley looked at her. She looked back at all of them with the expression of a woman who had made her company from nothing and was not accustomed to being argued with about her own decisions. My company, she said. My people, my building. She looked at Daniel. My call. He held her gaze, then he nodded. Roof access is through the stairwell on the north side, he said. 28 floors. We move fast and we move quiet. He looked at Hargrove. You set the pace on the way up. I lead when we get there. Hargrove nodded. They went back through the maintenance exit. The door opened from the outside with a manual override release. Daniel had checked it on the way down, the same way he'd checked everything, because checking things was the only habit from his former life that had never felt like a burden. They hit the stairwell and started climbing. It was 12:31 a.m., somewhere above them in a building, being held by people who had planned this night for months. 11 people were waiting in the dark, not knowing if anyone was coming. Daniel climbed and didn't let himself think about the last time he'd made a promise like that. The time the promise hadn't been enough. He climbed, and somewhere at the bottom of the stairwell, growing smaller with every floor, the alley where Castillo and Reyes were standing guard over the people he'd already brought out was becoming a fixed point in the past. Something finished, something real. Something that had happened despite everything that was supposed to stop it. 11 people. 11 was not 23, but it was not 0. And Daniel Cross had spent 9 years living with 0. I understood in his bones, in the place where grief becomes something harder and quieter and more permanent than feeling the exact weight of the difference between those two numbers. He was not going to add to the first one tonight. He climbed. Victoria climbed beside him. Hargrove climbed behind them both. And above them, 25 floors up in the dark, the roof of the East Annex, and whatever was waiting there, held itself in silence, patient and indifferent. The way all high places hold themselves in silence, waiting to see what comes up. They were on the 14th floor of the East Annex when Hargrove's phone buzzed. He glanced at it without breaking stride, then grabbed Daniel's arm. "External backup is 8 minutes out," he said. "NYPD Tactical 2 units. They're asking for a building layout." "Tell them to hold at the perimeter," Daniel said, not slowing down. "If they go in blind right now, Vale's people will use the trapped employees as leverage. We need that roof relay working first." Hargrove typed with one thumb while climbing stairs with the other hand on the railing. "And if the relay is damaged, then we figure something else out," Daniel said. "But it isn't damaged." "How do you know?" "Because Vale needed it intact," Daniel said. "He needed to monitor the building's emergency frequency, so he'd know the moment outside response was mobilized. You don't sabotage your own ears." Victoria, climbing just behind Daniel, said nothing, but he heard the quality of her silence change, the particular silence of someone filing information away at speed, building a picture from pieces. 16, 17, 18. At the 20th floor, Daniel stopped. Not because he heard something, because he didn't. And the absence of sound in a stairwell where there should have been the ambient noise of a building running its systems was itself a sound. A message. "Generator went down," he said. The emergency strips on the walls flickered once, steadied, then dropped to about 60% of their previous output. The building settling into backup power. The last layer before darkness. "How long?" Hargrove said. "Emergency battery for the annex lighting is rated for 4 hours, Daniel said. "But it's 3 years old, and it's been running since the first explosion. Realistically 90 minutes, maybe less." "We need to move faster," Victoria said. "We need to move carefully," Daniel said. "Fast and careless on a stairwell in the dark, get someone a broken ankle, and then we're carrying them." "Then carefully fast," she said. "Daniel, there are 11 people in that building." He looked at her. She looked back. Her jaw was set in the particular way of someone who is frightened and has decided that being frightened is not going to be the most important thing about them right now. "Carefully fast," he agreed. They kept climbing. It was 12:44 a.m. 22, 23, 24. Daniel's legs were burning in a way he hadn't felt in years. Not since the last time he'd operated in terrain that required this kind of sustained vertical movement. His body remembered what to do with the burn. Not fight it, not ignore it, absorb it, redistribute it, keep it from becoming the thing you're focused on instead of the thing in front of you. At the 25th floor landing, he heard voices above them. He stopped. Fist up. Everyone behind him stopped. 2 voices. 1 floor up. Relaxed cadence, not the clipped operational speech of people actively hunting someone. The cadence of people who were posted and waiting and had decided temporarily that nothing was coming. Daniel held up 2 fingers, pointed up, then held his hand flat. "Stay." He looked at Hargrove. Hargrove understood immediately. He moved up alongside Daniel, took the weapon he'd been carrying since Daniel handed it to him in the corridor, checked it with the quick efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times, and nodded. They went up together. The door on 26 opened onto a short access corridor utility space, the kind of functional nothing that existed between floors in buildings this size, and the two men were standing at the far end near the roof access door, their backs partially turned, one of them in the middle of a low conversation that died the moment Daniel and Hargrove came through. What happened next took about 11 seconds. Daniel didn't process it as a sequence of individual moments, the way you might reconstruct it later for a report. He processed it the way he'd been trained to process it, as a single continuous event. Input and response collapsed into one fluid action, no gap between seeing and moving. When it was over, both men were secured, disarmed, and sitting against the wall, with zip ties from the emergency kit Hargrove had been carrying in his jacket. Hargrove looked at Daniel with an expression that he was visibly struggling to keep neutral. 11 seconds, he said. Daniel was already at the roof access door. Stop counting. I'm not criticizing. I know. He tested the door handle, unlocked. Watch them. He went through. The roof of the East Annex was cold and open, and the New York City sky above it was the particular shade of deep orange-gray that came from 10 million lit windows, reflecting off low cloud cover. Down below 28 floors of it, the street was starting to show the first signs of emergency response perimeter establishment. Blue and red lights. The particular choreography of crisis. Daniel crossed to the communications relay station in under 20 seconds. It was a metal housing unit, about the size of a large filing cabinet, bolted to the roof surface, near the northeast corner. He opened the access panel with a maintenance key, the same keyring that had gotten them through the annex door 40 minutes ago, and looked inside. The hardline connection was intact. The independent power supply was running. The relay was live. He exhaled once through his nose. Let himself have exactly that one exhale, and then he pulled the emergency handset from its mounting bracket inside the panel and keyed it. This is a priority communication on the Sterling Horizon emergency frequency, he said. I need direct contact with whoever is running the tactical response at the perimeter, right now. Static. Then a voice professional controlled the voice of someone who had received calls like this before, but was still calibrating how seriously to take this particular one. Identify yourself. Daniel Cross. I was inside the building when the attack began. I have extracted the primary target, Victoria Sterling, and she is secure in the East Annex. I have a complete floor-by-floor layout of the threat positions and 11 confirmed civilian casualties. 11 confirmed civilians, still trapped floors, 28 through 31 of the main tower. He paused. I need you to put whoever is making entry decisions on this line in the next 60 seconds. Because your people are about to go into that building, and they are going to walk into the same traps that the internal security team walked into 2 hours ago. A pause. Longer than 60 seconds. Then a different voice. Older. The kind of voice that belonged to a man who had spent decades in rooms where decisions had weight. This is Deputy Commander Walsh, NYPD Tactical. You said 11 civilians. Yes. And you have their positions. I have their positions as of 70 minutes ago. Based on the movement patterns I know about, I can give you probable current positions within 2 floors of accuracy. How do you know their positions? I work in that building every night, Daniel said. I know whose light was on and whose wasn't when the first explosion hit. A beat. You're the janitor, Walsh said. Yes. The janitor is telling me he has better intelligence on my entry points than my team does. Yes. Another beat. Shorter this time. Talk to me, Walsh said. Daniel talked. I gave it all floor by floor, corridor by corridor. Every tampered panel he'd found. Every relay he'd photographed the position of Vale's people as best as he could reconstruct from the radio intercepts and the movements he'd tracked through the night. He gave it in the clean sequenced format of someone who had briefed operational teams before, without realizing for a moment that he was doing it until he heard himself and felt the old shape of the words in his mouth. Familiar. Worn smooth from use. He hadn't spoken like that in 9 years. Behind him, the roof access door opened, and Victoria and Hargrove came through. Victoria stood a few feet away and listened to him give the briefing and didn't say a word, and he was aware of her listening. The way you're aware of something bright at the edge of your peripheral vision, not looking at it directly, but knowing it's there. When he finished, Walsh was quiet for 4 seconds. "Cross," he said. "I'm going to need you on this line for the duration of entry." "Understood. And I'm going to need to know when this is over who you actually are." "Later," Daniel said. "Right now you have 11 people." Right, Walsh said. "Okay, here's what we're doing." It was 1:03 a.m. What followed was the most precise 47 minutes of Daniel Cross's life in 9 years, and he would never be able to fully explain afterward what it felt like to be back inside that particular kind of work. The kind where every word you say goes directly into the ears of people moving through danger. Where your voice is the difference between someone going left or right, between a door that's safe and a door that isn't. He'd missed it. I hadn't known that until he was doing it again. Or maybe he'd known it and hadn't let himself sit with the knowledge, because sitting with it meant sitting with everything attached to it, and the things attached to it had weight. He'd spent 9 years carefully not putting down in any place where he'd have to look at them. He talked Walsh's team through the main tower entry. He identified the 3 positions where Vale's people were most likely concentrated based on the radio traffic he'd intercepted. He flagged the compromised stairwells, the disabled emergency doors, the specific floors where structural damage from the initial explosions made certain corridors unstable. Walsh's people moved, and as they moved, Victoria Sterling stood on the roof of the East Annex, 28 floors above the street, listening to Daniel Cross direct a tactical operation through a hardline emergency relay, and understood in the complete and irreversible way that you understand certain things that she had spent 3.5 years walking past something she had never once looked at. At 1:11 a.m. Walsh came back on the line. "We have first contact on 28, 2 civilians both mobile. They're saying there's a group of 6 more on 29 holding in the East Conference Room." "That tracks," Daniel said. "The East Conference Room on 29 has a manual security lock on the interior. If someone in that group had the presence of mind to use it, they could have held that room all night." "Who would know about an interior lock like that?" "The building's administrative coordinator on that floor," Daniel said. "Her name is Patricia Wynn. She's worked in that building for 11 years. She would know." A beat. Then through the line, distant but audible, "Ma'am, are you Patricia Wynn?" And then muffled and exhausted and unmistakably the voice of someone who had spent 2 hours holding a room together through force of will. Yes I am. Are there more of you?" Daniel closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When he opened them, Victoria was looking at him. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. But something passed between them in that moment, something that didn't have a clean name, that existed in the space between what people go through together and what those things cost them, and it was real in the way that only things earned through actual difficulty are real. 8 confirmed out, Walsh said at 1:19 a.m. "Looking for 3 more. You said 28 through 31. The last 3 are almost certainly on 30, Daniel said. There's a locked server room on the north side, no windows, reinforced door. If they knew the building, that's where they'd go." "How do we access it?" "The override code for the server room door is on a 6-digit rotation," Daniel said. "It resets every Monday at midnight. Tonight's code is—" He stopped, looked at the night, pulled the number from the place in his memory where he stored the things nobody knew he paid attention to. 841726. Walsh read it back to him. "That's it," Daniel said. 2 minutes of silence. Then, "We're in. 3 civilians, all mobile, minor injuries." Hargrove, standing 6 feet away, sat down on the roof surface. Not dramatically, not with any performance of relief. Just sat down the way a person sits down when their legs decide that standing is no longer strictly necessary. Daniel looked at the city below. 11. All 11. He stayed with that number for a moment. Let it be real. Let it land in the place where the other number, the one from 9 years ago, still lived. It didn't erase anything. That wasn't how it worked, and he'd never believed it was. You don't balance grief. You don't cancel one loss with a corresponding save. That kind of math didn't hold. But 11 people were going home. And that was something. That was a real and specific and permanent something. He was still holding the handset when Walsh said cross. Still here. Vale's people we've secured 4, but Vale himself, he's not in the building. We've got footage of him leaving the main tower through a private exit at 12:40. He had a car waiting. Daniel felt something settle in his chest. Not surprise. The shape of a thing he'd already been preparing for without quite acknowledging it. Vale was gone. Of course he was. Men like Vale didn't stay in burning buildings. They built the fire, and then they left and watched it from a distance and waited to see who survived. He'll have a contingency, Daniel said. A place to go, an identity to step into. He's been planning this for a long time. We have a bolo out, Walsh said. Every exit from the city. Check his aircraft registrations, Daniel said. He has a private pilot's license. I heard him mention it once in a meeting I wasn't supposed to be listening to. If he has access to a small aircraft, he's not going by road. A pause. How did you know about the pilot's license? I told you, Daniel said. I work there every night. He set the handset back in its bracket, turned around. Victoria Sterling was standing directly behind him, close enough that he would have stepped into her if he'd moved without looking. She didn't step back. She stood her ground the way she stood everything, with the kind of stillness that wasn't passive but deliberate. He's gone, she said. Not a question. For now. He'll run. He'll try, Daniel said. She held his gaze for a long moment. Her expression had changed in the hours since the executive corridor, not broken down, not fractured, but stripped of the particular kind of professional composure that functions as armor, leaving something more direct underneath. Something that had looked at a very bad night and not looked away. The pilot's license, she said. You heard that in a meeting? Yes. Through the ventilation wall? Yes. She took a breath. What else do you know about the company? About the people in it? She paused. About me. He was quiet for a moment. I know you work late on Tuesdays and Thursdays, he said. I know you drink your coffee black until about 8 p.m., and then you switch to tea, which you also drink black. I know you keep a photograph in the bottom left drawer of your desk that you take out sometimes when you think everyone has left. I don't know who's in it. I never looked. He paused. I know you were planning to present evidence at Thursday's board meeting that would have exposed what Vale was doing. I heard him say so. She was very still. You heard that? 2 nights ago. And you didn't? She stopped herself. You filed a maintenance request, she said slowly. 3 months ago. You left a note at the security station. Yes. And nothing happened. Nothing happened. She looked at the city below them. At the lights. At the particular brightness of emergency response, concentrated at the base of her building, the controlled chaos of a situation being pulled back from the edge. I'm sorry, she said. I said that before in the elevator, but I want to say it again because the first time I said it, I didn't fully understand what I was apologizing for. She turned back to him. You tried to warn people who worked for me, and they didn't listen. And then tonight happened. She held his eyes. That's not just a security failure. That's a failure of the entire of the way this company treated people who didn't have a certain kind of title. Daniel said nothing. You saved 23 people tonight, she said. 11, he said. No, she said. I count. You brought 12 people out through the south stairwell before you came up to 34. I heard you tell Walsh about propping that door open. And then 11 more from 28 through 30. And me. And the 4 agents. She paused. That's 28. Plus Walsh's team has 4 of Vale's people secured, which means 4 fewer people available to hurt anyone else. She looked at him steadily. You saved 23 people tonight, at minimum. He held that. He hadn't added it up that way. He'd been too focused on the 11, on the specific weight of the people still inside, to turn around and look at what was already behind him. 23. The same number as the mission that had broken him. He didn't say that to her. He wasn't ready to say that to anyone yet. Maybe ever. But he felt it, the precise and painful irony of it. The universe's particular sense of symmetry in the place where he kept the things he didn't talk about. Daniel, Hargrove said from behind them. Both of them turned. Hargrove was standing up again. He'd been back on his feet for a few minutes, phone in hand, the operational part of him reasserting itself, and his expression had the quality of someone who was about to say something that wasn't straightforward. "Walsh just sent me something," he said. He looked at Daniel. "The aircraft registration check you suggested. They ran it." He paused. "Vale has a Cessna registered to a shell company. It's based at a private airfield in New Jersey. They called the airfield." Another pause. Longer. "The aircraft was reported fueled and ready at 11 p.m. tonight." 11 p.m. Before the attack had even started. Daniel let that land. Vale had fueled his escape aircraft before the attack began, which meant the attack was never supposed to go on this long, which meant something tonight had gone wrong, for Vale had not gone according to the plan that had been months in the making, and whatever had gone wrong had cost him his clean exit window. "He didn't get to the airfield in time," Daniel said. "No," Hargrove said. "The airfield manager says the plane is still there. Vale never showed." He looked at his phone. "NYPD has the airfield under watch, but Walsh wants to know if Vale didn't go to the airfield. Where did he go?" The three of them stood on the roof in the cold air, and the question sat between them like something with its own weight. Daniel thought about Richard Vale. Not the version of Vale he'd constructed from second-hand information and ventilation wall conversations. The real version, the one he'd been working for, however indirectly, for 3.5 years. A man who wore his certainty like a second skin. A man who built plans with redundancies because he had never trusted any single point of failure. A man who had specifically deliberately placed Daniel Cross in that building. That last part. That was the part that still didn't sit right. Vale had said it himself on the earpiece on the bridge. "I told them you'd be a problem. They didn't believe me." Which meant Vale knew who Daniel was, had known for some time, had made the decision to keep him in the building anyway. Why you don't keep a problem close to you because you think it won't be a problem. You keep it close because you think you can control it. Because you think proximity gives you an advantage over distance. Which meant Vale had believed right up until something tonight changed his calculation that Daniel was controllable. That he was broken enough to stay broken. And when Vale's calculation changed, when he realized at some point between the first explosion and 12:40 a.m. that Daniel Cross was not going to stay in the corner he'd been put in, he'd had a second plan. Not the airfield. The airfield was the first plan. The second plan was something else. Something that was already in motion. "He's not running," Daniel said. Both Hargrove and Victoria looked at him. "He fueled that plane as a decoy," Daniel said, "or as a first option. Either way, he didn't use it, and he didn't use it specifically because he couldn't get there by 12:40 a.m., which means between 11 p.m. and 12:40 a.m., something changed." He looked at Hargrove. "What's in this building in the annex?" Hargrove frowned. "What do you mean?" "The annex has a separate management structure from the main tower," Daniel said. "Separate entry, separate systems, different security team. What's stored here that isn't stored in the main tower?" Hargrove looked at Victoria. Victoria's expression shifted. Shifted in the specific way of someone who has just understood something 2 seconds before they wanted to. "The backup servers," she said. Her voice was very controlled. Almost too controlled. "The main tower's data infrastructure has a backup array in the annex basement. It's why we built the annex data redundancy. Everything on those servers, every financial record, every internal communication, every piece of evidence I've been compiling for the last 8 months." She stopped. Daniel was already moving toward the roof access door. "He didn't run," Daniel said. "He came here." The door opened before he reached it, and Richard Vale stepped through with 2 men behind him and a look on his face that was not the look of a man who was losing. It was the look of a man who had been waiting. "Hello, Daniel," Vale said. His voice was exactly as it had been on the earpiece, smooth cold, the voice of a man for whom every room he walked into was already a room he owned. He looked around the roof, at Hargrove, at Victoria, back at Daniel. "I was wondering how long it would take you to figure it out." He had no weapon visible. He didn't need one. The 2 men behind him had enough between them for everyone on the roof. "The servers," Daniel said. "Already handled," Vale said pleasantly. 3 minutes ago. Everything she had, everything she spent the last 8 months building gone. He looked at Victoria. I want you to understand that this was never personal. You built something impressive. I just needed it to be mine. Victoria looked at him with an expression that Daniel had not seen on her face before tonight. Not fear, not grief. The look of a woman who had been expecting this, who had prepared for exactly this. Richard, she said calmly. The backup servers in the basement have been running a continuous encrypted mirror to an off-site location since 7 p.m. tonight. Vale's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. I knew about the threat 2 days ago, she said. I didn't know the timeline, but I knew someone was coming for the evidence. She paused. Did you think I built this company without learning how to protect what matters? The silence on that roof lasted about 4 seconds. And in those 4 seconds, Richard Vale's face did something Daniel had never expected to see. It lost its certainty. Not completely, not all at once, but enough, just enough to show the thing underneath. The thing that lived under every man who had built his entire life on controlling outcomes and had just encountered the one outcome he hadn't controlled. One of the men behind Vale shifted position, and Daniel moved, not toward Vale, toward the relay station. He had the emergency handset in his hand before anyone else had fully processed what he was doing, and he was already talking when the second man raised his weapon. Walsh, he said. Roof of the East Annex, right now, bring everyone. Then he set the handset down, turned around, and looked at Richard Vale, and he said quietly, without anger, without the performance of triumph, the thing that had been true since 12:40 a.m. when Vale had made the decision to come to the annex instead of the airfield. You came back for the evidence because you couldn't leave without destroying it, because without it, you knew she could still take everything from you. Daniel held his eyes. You couldn't run. Not really. Because running meant she'd already won. Vale looked at him. And you thought I was the broken one, Daniel said. Richard Vale said nothing. Below them, the sound of boots on stairs, fast, multiple, purposeful, was already rising through the building. Vale heard it. He looked at the door, at the 2 men behind him, back at Daniel. And then he did something no one on that roof expected. He sat down, not dramatically, not with any ceremony. He simply sat down on the roof surface in his expensive suit in the cold air of a New York night and put his hands on his knees. Like a man who had finally stopped running from the thing he'd always known was going to catch him. It was supposed to be clean, he said to no one in particular. None of this was supposed to take this long. Walsh's team came through the roof door 30 seconds later, and Daniel Cross stood in the cold air above the city and watched the man who had tried to burn everything down get to his feet and put his hands where the officers directed. Hargrove was on his phone. Castillo and Reyes had come up from below. At some point, he hadn't heard them arrive, and Castillo was standing near Victoria with the particular stillness of someone who'd decided professionally that the principal was safe and she was going to stand close anyway. Victoria Sterling stood a few feet from Daniel and watched Walsh's team work and didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said quietly, "It's over." "This part," Daniel said. She looked at him sideways. "There's another part." He looked at the city, at the lights, at the first gray beginning of something at the eastern edge of the sky that was too early to be dawn, but was the promise of it. "There's always another part," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Daniel," she said. "Yeah." "What's your daughter's name?" He looked at her. "Lily," he said. "You should call her," Victoria said, "before she wakes up and turns on the news." He reached into his jacket pocket. His phone had been on silent since 11 p.m. He looked at the screen. 4 missed calls, all from the same number. His neighbor Mrs. Okafor, who had a spare key for emergencies, and who had lived across the hall for 2 years, and who had on more than one occasion told Daniel Cross that he worked too many nights and that little girls needed their fathers present. And one text message sent at 12:58 a.m. from a number he didn't recognize, but that he understood immediately from the area code. The text said, "She's fine. She's asleep. We've been watching the news. Come home, soldier." He stared at it for a long time. Then he pressed call on Mrs. Okafor's number. She picked up on the first ring. "I saw your building on the news," she said immediately. "Are you all right?" "I'm all right," he said. A pause. "She's sleeping. She doesn't know." "Good," he said. "Keep it that way until I get there." "How long?" He looked at the roof, at Walsh's team managing the scene, at Hargrove, who had caught his eye and given him a short nod that communicated wordlessly that he could step away and nothing would fall apart. "An hour," he said. "Maybe less." "I'll make coffee," Mrs. Okafor said. "You sound like you need it." She hung up. Daniel held the phone for a moment. Then he put it in his pocket and looked at the city one more time and thought about Lily sleeping with her nightlight on and one arm hanging off the mattress and her shoes in the middle of the doorway. He thought about all the mornings he'd tripped over those shoes, all the mornings he hadn't been able to stay angry. He was going to trip over them again in about 2 hours. He couldn't wait. He got home at 2:47 a.m. Mrs. Okafor opened the apartment door before he knocked, which meant she'd been watching through the peephole, which meant she'd been standing in her hallway, waiting for the sound of the elevator. She was a small woman, 63 years old, with the particular kind of stillness that came from having raised 4 children and buried a husband and decided somewhere along the way that very little in life was worth being dramatic about. She looked at him for a long moment. At his jacket, which had a tear in the left shoulder he hadn't noticed until now. At his hands. At his face. "Coffee's on the stove," she said. "Lily's in her room." "Thank you," he said, "for staying." "Don't thank me," she said. "Thank me by sleeping more than 3 hours tonight." She paused at her door. "Daniel." He looked at her. "Whatever you did in that building," she said, "I'm glad you came home." She went back inside. He stood in his own hallway for a moment, just standing the particular quality of silence that existed in his apartment at 3 a.m., settling around him like something physical. Then he walked to Lily's door and opened it 6 inches and looked in. She was exactly where she always was. Blanket up to her chin, one arm off the mattress. Nightlight casting everything in that soft amber that she'd insisted on since she was 4 years old, and that he'd never once considered removing. Her face was completely relaxed in the way children's faces are relaxed when they sleep, utterly absent of the small accumulated weights of the day. He stood there for longer than he meant to. Then he pulled her door back to exactly 6 inches. Went to the kitchen, poured the coffee Mrs. Okafor had left on the stove, and sat at his kitchen table. He did not sleep. He sat with the coffee and the quiet, and thought about nothing in particular, and everything at once, which was the only way his brain knew how to process a night like this. Not in sequence, not in analysis, but in the scattered non-linear way of a system coming slowly back to baseline. At some point before sunrise, he thought about the text message. The one from the number he didn't recognize. "Come home, soldier." He'd looked up the area code on his way home in the cab. Virginia. Northern Virginia. He knew what was in Northern Virginia. He hadn't texted back. He wasn't ready to think about that yet. There would be a time for it. Tonight wasn't it. He drank his coffee and listened to his daughter breathe 2 rooms away and let the city do what the city did outside his window. And when Lily's alarm went off at 6:15 a.m., he was already at the stove making eggs. She came out of her room with her hair sideways and one sock on and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at him with the particular expression of a 9-year-old who was very smart and knew something was different but couldn't locate exactly what. "You're home," she said. "I'm home," he said. "You're making eggs." "I'm making eggs." She looked at him for another second. Then she went and sat at the table and said nothing more about it, which was one of the things Daniel Cross loved most about his daughter. She had an instinct for when to push and when to simply let something be present. He scrambled the eggs the way she liked them, put the plate in front of her, sat across from her with his 3rd cup of coffee. She ate 3 bites and then looked up at him. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "Your jacket has a hole in it." He looked at the jacket he'd hung over the back of his chair. The tear in the left shoulder. He'd forgotten about it again. "I know," he said. She went back to her eggs. "Are you okay?" "Okay," she said without looking up. He looked at her. At the top of her head. at the particular way she held her fork, which was exactly the way her mother had held a fork. A thing he'd noticed when Lily was about 5, and had never been able to unnotice since. "Yeah," he said. "I'm okay." She looked up this time. "Promise," she said. He held her eyes. "Promise," he said. She nodded, went back to her eggs. And that was it. That was the whole conversation, and it was in its own way the most important conversation of the entire night. He walked her to school at 7:45 a.m. the way he always did on the mornings he was home. They passed the shoe store on the corner that she always slowed down in front of, and the coffee cart she always asked him to stop at, even though she didn't drink coffee, and the particular crack in the sidewalk on Elm that she'd been stepping over since she was 6 years old and never once stepped on. At the school door, she turned around and hugged him fast tight, the hug of a child who had learned that her father sometimes disappeared into nights she didn't fully understand and who had developed as a result a habit of holding on for 1 extra second every time he left. She let go and went inside without looking back because that was also Lily. She knew how to leave cleanly. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Then he got in a cab and went back to work. Not the building. Not yet. The building was a crime scene, would be a crime scene for days. He went to the Sterling Horizon satellite office in Midtown, where Victoria's assistant had already redirected the executive team, and where by the time Daniel arrived at 9:30 a.m. in the same torn jacket he'd worn all night, there were already 3 network news vans on the street outside, and a police liaison officer in the lobby. The assistant, a young woman named Grace, who had always been professionally invisible to Daniel in the way that support staff often were to each other, looked up when he walked in and did something he hadn't expected. She stood up. Not formally, not as a performance. She just stood up the way you stand up when someone walks into a room that they've earned. "Mr. Cross," she said, "Ms. Sterling is expecting you." He stopped. In 3.5 years, not one person in that company had called him Mr. Cross. He didn't know what to do with it. So he just nodded and followed Grace to the conference room, where Victoria had set up a temporary command structure with the particular efficiency of someone who had not slept and had decided that sleep was a problem for a different version of herself. She was on the phone when he came in. She held up one finger without looking at him, the universal signal for 1 minute, and kept talking. The call lasted 45 seconds, and in those 45 seconds, Daniel took stock of the room. Hargrove in the corner freshly changed dark circles under his eyes. A man Daniel didn't recognize from the company's legal team. 2 people from the board of directors who had clearly been called in first thing. And sitting along the wall with a cup of coffee and the expression of a man who had been awake for 24 hours and had somewhere important to be Deputy Commander Walsh. Walsh looked at Daniel when he walked in. He had the face of a man in his late 50s, broad-lived in the kind of face that had processed a lot of information over a lot of years and had learned to keep most of it internal. He'd been a tactical commander for long enough that reading people had become involuntary, and the way he was reading Daniel right now was the way you read someone whose file you've already looked at. Daniel knew that look. Victoria ended her call, looked at Daniel, looked at Walsh. "I'll leave you two," she said, which surprised him. This was her meeting, her office, her company, but she said it with the ease of someone making a deliberate choice, not a deferential one. She touched Daniel's arm briefly as she passed him, just a hand on the sleeve for about a second, and then she was out the door, and it was just Daniel and Walsh and the legal counsel, who was staring at his laptop and pretending not to listen. Walsh stood up. "Cross," he said. "Walsh," Daniel said. They looked at each other for a moment. "You want to tell me," Walsh said, "or you want me to tell you what I already know?" Daniel sat down. "What do you know?" he said. Walsh sat back down across from him. He folded his hands on the table. Large hands, the hands of someone who had spent decades in physical work before moving into command, and he looked at Daniel with the directness of a man who had decided to skip the part where they danced around it. "Daniel Cross," Walsh said, 44 years old, originally from Dayton, Ohio. Military service, which is where it gets interesting because your service record has sections that don't exist. And I mean that literally. I mean there are dates and deployments where the file just stops. Pages that would be there in a normal record that aren't there. And I've been doing this long enough to know what that particular kind of absence means." He paused. "After the service, there's a gap of about 18 months. Nothing. No employment records, no address. And then you show up in New York. A Queen's address, a social security number that's real but barely used, and a job application to a building maintenance company." Another pause. "And I know about the Sentinel response team." The room was very quiet. The legal counsel had stopped typing. Daniel didn't move. "How?" he said. "Because I served with a man named Gerald Oates," Walsh said. "Who served with you? Jerry's retired now. He called me at 2 a.m. when he saw your building on the news and heard your name on the police scanner." Walsh held his eyes. He said, and I'm quoting, that if Daniel Cross was in that building when everything went down, then the people in that building were the luckiest people in New York tonight. Daniel looked at the table. Something in his chest did something complicated that he didn't examine directly. "I haven't talked to Jerry in 9 years, he said. "He knows," Walsh said. "He figured you needed space, but he's been keeping track." A pause. "After Kandahar." The word sat in the air between them. Kandahar. The last operation. The wrong intelligence. The 6 men he'd sent into a position that was supposed to be clear and wasn't. The 6 men who hadn't come back. The 6 names he still said in order quietly on the anniversary of that date, because forgetting felt like a second death, and he wouldn't do that to them. "I sent them in," Daniel said. "The intelligence was wrong, and I sent them in anyway because I trusted the source, and the source was wrong, and 6 people are dead because of a call I made." "The source was compromised," Walsh said. "The investigation concluded." "I know what the investigation concluded," Daniel said. "I read every word of it. It doesn't change what I did." Walsh was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It doesn't. It also doesn't change what you did last night." He let that sit. Then, "Cross. The people in that building last night, 23 of them are home right now because of you, including the woman who runs the company. I've been doing this work for 30 years, and I've never seen one person without a weapon hold a situation together like that." He leaned forward slightly. "Whatever happened in Kandahar, that's real. That grief is real. I'm not going to sit here and tell you how to carry it. But I am going to tell you that the way you operated last night is not the way a broken man operates." Daniel said nothing. "Jerry said something else," Walsh said. "He said the thing that always made you exceptional even before Kandahar was that you never operated for yourself. You operated for the people next to you. And that's not a skill. That's not training. That's who you are." He paused. "Cleaning floors for 3.5 years doesn't change who you are. It just changes the floors." The legal counsel had definitely stopped working now. He was looking at his laptop screen with the studied neutrality of someone pretending to look at his laptop screen. Daniel sat with Walsh's words for a moment. He didn't argue with them. He didn't agree with them exactly. He just let them exist in the room. "Vale knew who I was," Daniel said finally. "Yes. That's not random. He placed me in that building deliberately." Walsh nodded. "We think so. We're working on how he knew. Someone talked." A pause. "Someone from your former life." Daniel had been expecting this. He'd been holding it at the edge of his thinking since Vale had said his name on the earpiece the night before they knew your name, and the calculation had been sitting in the back of his mind ever since, waiting for him to have the space and the stillness to look at it directly. Vale needed someone in the building who understood the structure well enough to potentially interfere, Daniel said slowly. But he didn't want to remove me because removing me would have required explaining why I was a threat, and explaining that would have exposed what he knew about my background. So he kept me close. "He underestimated you," Walsh said. "He thought 9 years of cleaning floors had been enough," Daniel said. "He thought I was done." "Were you?" Walsh said. Daniel looked at him. "No," he said. "Apparently not." The door opened, and Victoria came back in with 2 cups of coffee and a look on her face that said she'd been listening through the gap in the door for at least the last 5 minutes and had decided to stop pretending she wasn't. She set 1 cup in front of Daniel. She sat down. She looked at Walsh. "Are you done?" "Almost," Walsh said. "Cross, the DA's office is going to want a statement. full accounting of the night, and there's a federal component developing around Vale's financial activities that's going to want its own interview. He paused. Your background, the parts of your record that don't exist, they're going to come up. I know, Daniel said. I can manage that, Walsh said. I have relationships with the relevant people. Your service remains classified, but there are ways to characterize your expertise that don't require opening files that shouldn't be opened. He paused. If you want that. Daniel looked at him. Why would you do that? Because Jerry Oates asked me to, Walsh said simply. And because I've been in this work long enough to know that the people who actually save lives are rarely the ones who get the press conference. He stood up, held out his hand. I'll be in touch about the statement. Get some sleep first. Daniel shook his hand. Walsh left. The legal counsel found somewhere very important to be and also left. And it was just Daniel and Victoria in the temporary conference room with 2 cups of coffee and the morning light coming through the windows and the sound of the city doing what it always did. And for about 30 seconds, neither of them said anything. Then Victoria said, "How's Lily?" He looked at her. She noticed the hole in my jacket, he said. Something softened in Victoria's expression. Not much. She wasn't a woman who did things in large gestures, but enough. She sounds perceptive. She gets it from her mother, he said, and then immediately felt the particular awkwardness of having said something real and personal in a professional context. The specific discomfort of a man who had spent years managing the distance between those two things. But Victoria didn't treat it as awkward. She just nodded the way she nodded at everything with the full weight of her attention, like information was information, regardless of where it came from. Daniel, she said, I want to offer you something, and I want you to hear the whole thing before you respond. He nodded. I'm restructuring the company's emergency response and security division, she said. Vale's entire team, everyone he had installed in those positions, they're gone. All of them. Some of them knew, some of them were compromised. Some of them were just bad at their jobs. Either way, I'm building it from the ground up. She held his eyes. I want you to lead it. He'd known this was coming. Some version of it. He'd felt it approaching since the elevator, since the bridge, since the roof, since the coffee at 3 a.m. He'd been thinking about what he would say when it arrived. I'm a janitor, he said. You were never just a janitor, she said. You didn't know that until last night. No, she said. That's true, and that's on me. She paused. But I know it now. He looked at his coffee. The people who report to this position, he said. The security team, the emergency coordinators, they're going to look at me and see the man who used to clean their floors. Some of them, Victoria said. And then they're going to remember last night. And those two things are going to have to figure out how to coexist, and that's going to be uncomfortable. And I think you're probably the only person I know who can manage that discomfort productively. She paused. I watched you last night. You didn't need people to respect you to lead them. You just needed them to pay attention. And they did. Another pause. Hargrove asked me this morning if he could be reassigned to your team. That man has never voluntarily worked under anyone who outranked him by less than a decade. Daniel looked up. Hargrove asked, he said. He called it a professional development opportunity, Victoria said, which from Hargrove is basically a declaration of devotion. Something moved through Daniel's chest, not quite amusement, and not quite something bigger, but in the neighborhood of both. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, The people who were trapped last night, the 11 above 28. Yes, I want to meet them, he said. Not as part of anything official. Not as part of the new role or the restructuring. I want to meet them as myself. He paused. Before anything else changes, I want to do that. Victoria looked at him. Why? She said, not suspiciously. She asked it the way she asked everything because she genuinely wanted to know. Because they were in the dark for 2 hours not knowing if anyone was coming, he said. And someone came. And I want them to be able to put a face to that. Not a title, not a division head. Just a person who knew their lights were on and came back for them. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Okay, she said. Okay. I'll arrange it, she said. Today if you want. He nodded. Then he said, I'll take the job. She didn't make a thing of it. She didn't smile in the way of someone who had achieved a goal. She just nodded the same way she'd nodded at everything else and picked up her coffee. There's one more thing, she said. Okay. The board is meeting this afternoon. Emergency session they need to be briefed on last night and on the path forward. I'm going to tell them about the evidence about Vale, about the restructuring. She paused. I want you there. As what? He said. As the person who kept this company alive last night, she said. They're going to ask questions. I want them to hear the answers from you. He thought about sitting in a boardroom, about the kind of table that cost more than his car, about men and women in suits looking at the man who used to push a cleaning cart through the executive floor every Tuesday and Thursday night. All right, he said. She looked at him over her coffee cup. You're not nervous. I've briefed worse rooms, he said. She almost smiled. Almost. I believe you. The board meeting was at 2 p.m. Daniel went home, first changed into the only suit he owned. Dark gray, bought 3 years ago for a parent-teacher conference that had ended up being more formal than expected, and came back to the satellite office at 1:45 p.m. Grace looked up from her desk when he walked in. You look different, she said. Different suit, he said. No, she said. Different. She said it as a fact, not a compliment, not a judgment. Just an observation. He went into the conference room. The board of Sterling Horizon Technologies consisted of 9 people. 6 he'd seen before. In passing on the executive floor, faces he recognized, from the way you recognize faces you've seen regularly without ever quite seeing. 3 he'd never encountered. They all looked at him when he walked in. He sat in the chair. Victoria indicated at the side of the table rather than at the head, and he looked back at each of them with the steady, unhurried attention of a man who had learned to read rooms in environments where reading them incorrectly had consequences that made a board meeting look like a quiet Tuesday. Victoria stood at the head of the table. Last night, she said, this company was attacked from the inside. The person responsible is in custody. The evidence of his financial crimes is intact. Our employees are safe. She paused. The reason for all 3 of those things is the man sitting to my right. I'd like you to hear from him directly. 9 pairs of eyes on Daniel Cross. He took a breath, and then he told them. Not the whole story, not Kandahar, not the Sentinel response team, not the 9 years of quiet and cleaning and 4 a.m. doorways, but the night. Last night, start to finish. What he'd seen, what he'd known, what he'd done about it, and why. He talked for 11 minutes. When he finished, the boardroom was quiet in the specific way of rooms where the people in them are rearranging something inside themselves. Then a man at the far end of the table, silver-haired in his late 60s, the kind of face that had seen a lot of things and decided a long time ago not to be impressed by things that weren't worth being impressed by, said, you've been cleaning this building for 3 years. 3.5, Daniel said. And in that time you filed maintenance requests that were ignored. Yes. And left security notes that went unanswered. Yes. The man was quiet for a moment. What would have happened, he said slowly, if someone had listened to you 3 months ago? Daniel looked at him. Last night wouldn't have happened, he said. Or it would have happened differently. Less damage. Fewer people in danger. He paused. But I don't think that's the right question. What's the right question? The right question, Daniel said, is how many other people in your company right now are seeing things that nobody is listening to? How many maintenance staff, cleaning crews, administrative coordinators, front desk workers, people who are in the building at every hour, who know every corridor and every habit and every anomaly, how many of them have tried to tell someone something and been told to stay in their lane? He let that sit. Vale planned this for months. He planned it carefully and he planned it well. But he made one mistake. He assumed the people nobody listened to had stopped paying attention. He looked at Victoria. They hadn't. The silver-haired man looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at Daniel. And across the table, the 9 members of the Sterling Horizon board sat with that for a moment, the specific weight of it, the thing it asked of them, the thing it would cost them to actually do something with it, rather than just feel bad about it and move on. Then the silver-haired man. His name was Arthur Hensley, and he'd been on the board for 12 years, and he was the kind of man who said few words and meant every one of them said, "What do you need?" Daniel looked at him. "A policy," he said. "Not a memo, not a training module. An actual binding enforceable policy that gives every employee in this company at every level the authority to report something that doesn't look right, and the guarantee that the report will be taken seriously and investigated within 24 hours. He paused. "And a direct line, not through layers of management. A direct line to whoever is running security." "Which will be you," Victoria said. "Which will be me," Daniel said. Hensley looked at the rest of the board. Something passed around the table, not words, just the particular silent communication of people who have made enough decisions together that they've developed a shorthand for it. Then Hensley looked back at Daniel. "Done," he said. It was 2:34 p.m. And Daniel Cross, who had walked into that building 39 hours ago with a broken cleaning cart and a photograph of his daughter in his pocket, sat at a table where decisions were made and felt for the first time in 9 years that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not because the room was impressive, not because of the title, or the policy, or the 15 pairs of eyes that had spent the last 11 minutes listening to him the way they'd never once listened to the man who cleaned their offices. But because 11 people were home. Because 23 people were home. Because Lily's shoes were in the middle of the doorway, and he was going to trip over them in the morning, and he was never going to stay angry about it. Because somewhere in a building across the city, a woman named Patricia Wynn had spent 2 hours holding a conference room door closed and keeping 6 people calm in the dark. And she had done it with the competence of someone who had been underestimated her entire career and had long since decided to be competent anyway. Because the people nobody listened to had been paying attention all along. And last night, finally, it had mattered. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He looked at it under the table. A text from Lily sent from the school office, which meant she'd asked a teacher to use the phone, which meant it was important to her. It said, "Dad, I saw on the news. Were you the one?" He looked at it for a moment. Then he typed back, "Come home, and I'll tell you about it." 3 seconds. Then promise. He smiled. Just slightly. The particular smile of a man who had a lot of things in his life that were hard, and one thing that was completely uncomplicated, perfectly simple. Promise, he typed. He put the phone back in his pocket. The board meeting continued around him. And Daniel Cross sat at the table in his 3-year-old suit and paid attention the way he always had, the way he'd never been able to stop to everything happening in the room. The board meeting ended at 4:17 p.m. Daniel walked out of the satellite office into the afternoon and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the city settle around him the way it always did. Loud, indifferent, enormous, moving at the speed of 10 million people who all had somewhere to be. A cab honked. 2 women with coffee cups pushed past him without looking up. A delivery truck idled at the corner, and the driver leaned out the window and said something to someone Daniel couldn't see. Normal. All of it. The specific, unremarkable normal of a city that had a crisis somewhere in it every single day and kept moving anyway. He took the subway home. Not a cab this time. The subway. The way he took it every morning after his shift. The familiar sequence of platforms and transfers, and the particular smell of the underground that he'd stopped noticing 3 years ago. He stood in the car and held the overhead bar and watched the other riders. A teenage boy with headphones, a woman reading a paperback with a cracked spine, an old man in a postal uniform who had fallen asleep with his chin on his chest and felt the specific comfort of being among people who had no idea who he was. That comfort, he understood now, was going to change. Not completely, not immediately, but the news had been running the story since early morning, and Walsh's public statement had mentioned carefully and without classified specifics the role of a building employee in coordinating the civilian rescue. No name yet. But names had a way of becoming public, especially when 23 people knew them, and most of those 23 people had families who had been up all night watching the news. He had maybe 48 hours before someone put it together. He thought about that on the train and decided he didn't mind as much as he expected to. Lily was home when he got there. She'd let herself in with her key. She'd had a key since she was 7, because Daniel worked nights, and there were afternoons when Mrs. Okafor wasn't available, and Lily was the kind of child who could be trusted with a key, and she was sitting at the kitchen table with her homework in front of her, but not actually doing it, which he knew, because she looked up the moment he came through the door, with the expression of someone who had been waiting and was done pretending she was doing something else. "Dad," she said. "Hey, Lil." She stood up. She crossed to him and hugged him, not the quick, clean hug of the school doorway, but a real one. The kind that said she'd been watching the news since she got home, and had been sitting with a specific fear for the last 2 hours, and needed to put it somewhere. He held on. After a moment, she stepped back and looked at him with those clear, direct eyes that were her mother's eyes, and said, "Were you scared?" I thought about lying. He thought about the version of the answer that was technically true, but managed around the parts that would worry her. He thought about all the ways he'd learned to talk to her about the things he did. The careful language, the deliberate simplicity, the protection of her childhood from the specific weight of the world he lived in. Then he thought about what he'd said to Walsh that morning, about not letting fear make his decisions. "Yeah," he said. "I was scared." She looked at him. "But you stayed," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I stayed." She processed that for a moment, that 9-year-old processing the kind that happened visibly. You could watch it move through her face, and then she nodded the way she nodded at things that were real and difficult and true. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said, and went back to her homework. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and felt something in his chest that didn't have a clean name. The complicated love of a father who had been scared and stayed anyway, and come home to find that his daughter, 9 years old, and clear-eyed, and with her mother's way of holding a fork, had understood exactly what that meant. Then he made dinner. 3 days later, they met the 11. Victoria had arranged it quietly. No press, no cameras, no official company event. Just a room, a Thursday afternoon, and 11 people who had spent 2 hours in the dark waiting for someone to come. They came in ones and twos. Most of them with family, a husband who hadn't left his wife's side since she'd walked out of the building at 1:30 a.m., a sister who had driven from Connecticut at 3 a.m. and still hadn't gone home, a college-aged son who had his mother's arm and kept looking at her like he needed to confirm she was physically present. Patricia Wynne came alone. Daniel recognized her immediately, not from having met her, but from the picture he'd constructed over 3.5 years of Tuesday and Thursday nights on her floor. The administrative coordinator on 29. She was in her early 50s, compact with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the specific bearing of a woman who had spent decades being the most competent person in rooms where she was also the most overlooked. She walked directly to Daniel. She didn't make a speech about it. She didn't cry, though he could see she'd been crying recently, the particular clarity that comes to a face after tears have finished. She just held out her hand, and when he shook it, she held on for a moment longer than a handshake required. "They told me what you said," she said. "On the radio when you called in our positions, that you knew we were in the East Conference Room because Patricia Wynne would know about the interior lock." She looked at him steadily. "You knew my name." "I know everyone's name on every floor I work," he said. "No," she said. "You don't. I've watched the night staff for 11 years. They know the floors. They know the offices. They don't know the names." She paused. "You actually saw us. Every one of us. The whole time." He didn't know what to say to that. So he just said, "You held that room for 2 hours, Ms. Wynne, with 6 people in the dark and no information. That's not nothing." She looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said. "It's not." She released his hand. "Neither is what you did." The afternoon moved through him in pieces, conversations he'd remember in fragments, later the particular quality of a room full of people who had shared an experience that couldn't be fully communicated to anyone who wasn't there. A man named Gerald, who kept saying he couldn't believe it had been the overnight janitor, not in a dismissive way, but in the genuine astonishment of someone updating a fundamental assumption about the world. A young woman named Simone from the IT department on 28, who had been the first person Walsh's team reached, and who grabbed Daniel's arm when she saw him, and said with a directness that surprised him, I heard your voice on the radio. When Walsh called in our position, he said a man named Cross had given it to him. I didn't know who that was, but I kept thinking about the name the whole time we were waiting. Cross. Like something to hold on to. She paused. Does that make sense? Yeah, Daniel said. It does. Lily was there sitting next to Mrs. Okafor along the far wall because Daniel had decided after a conversation with himself that had lasted most of Wednesday night that she was old enough to understand what her father did and who he was and why he made the choices he made. She sat quietly through most of it, watching, doing the thing she always did, where she took in information without performing a reaction to it. At some point, Patricia Wynne sat down next to her. Daniel was across the room when it happened and couldn't hear what they said. Wynne said something. Lily said something back. Wynne smiled in the specific way of someone who has just been surprised by a child, but he watched it and felt the particular fullness of seeing two things from his life occupy the same space and fit together in a way he hadn't planned. After the last of the 11 left, Victoria pulled Daniel aside. They stood in the corner of the empty room with its moved chairs and its half-empty water glasses and its particular post-gathering quiet. Wynne asked about the new policy, Victoria said. Already. She pulled up the board statement on her phone before she left the parking garage. Something like admiration moved through Victoria's expression. She wanted to know the enforcement mechanism for the 24-hour response guarantee. What did you tell her? I told her to ask you, Victoria said, since you're the one who designed it. He looked at her. She's going to be a very useful person, he said. I know, Victoria said. I'm promoting her. A pause. I'm also promoting 6 other people in the next 2 weeks. People who've been in positions they've outgrown for too long because nobody was paying attention. She said it with the directness of a woman who had made a decision and was describing it, not announcing it for approval. The board approved a full structural review of every promotion and salary decision in the company for the last 5 years. If someone was passed over for a reason that had more to do with their title than their performance. She stopped. It's overdue. Yeah, Daniel said. I know it doesn't fix last night. Nothing fixes last night, he said. Last night is done. It's real. People were scared and some people were hurt, and a man who worked for you for 6 years was trying to destroy everything you built. He paused. But you're still here. The company's still here. The evidence is intact. He looked at her. You prepared for this. 2 months ago when you set up the off-site mirror. You made a decision when you didn't know how bad it was going to get, or when. She was quiet for a moment. I was afraid, she said. I know, he said. You stayed anyway. She looked at him with something in her expression that he hadn't seen there before and didn't quite have a name for, and then she said, Jerry Oates called me. Daniel went very still. Gerald Oates, she said. He found my direct number. I don't know how, but honestly after last week I've stopped being surprised by what people can find when they want to. She paused. He told me about Kandahar. He told me about the Sentinel response team. He told me about the 6 men. She held his eyes. He told me what you've been carrying. Daniel looked at the window. He shouldn't have done that, he said. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it. Not anger, not quite. The feeling of something private being in a room it hadn't been invited into. He did it because he's been watching you disappear for 9 years, and he thought someone in your life should know who you actually are, Victoria said. His words. A pause. He also said he wanted me to tell you something. Daniel looked back at her. He said the intelligence was wrong, the source was compromised, and the 6 men knew the risks the same way every person in that unit knew the risks. He said they were your brothers, and they would not want you cleaning floors for the rest of your life. She paused. He said they'd want you to do exactly what you did 3 nights ago. The room was very quiet. Daniel stood with that for a moment that was longer than it felt. He thought about the 6 names. The names he said in order on the anniversary, the way other people said prayers. Not because he believed it changed anything. Because forgetting was the one thing he wouldn't do to them. He thought about Patricia Wynne in the East Conference Room, holding a door closed in the dark. He thought about 11 people going home. He thought about 23. Jerry always talked too much, he said finally. Victoria almost smiled. He said you'd say that. And then, because the moment had reached the edge of something that would become too large if he let it. Daniel said, "The new division structure. I want to start building the team next week." Victoria accepted the redirect with the grace of a woman who understood when to let things land and when to let them pass. "Monday," she said. "I'll have HR set up the interviews." "I don't want HR running the interviews," he said. "I want to do them myself." "Of course you do," she said. "What are you looking for?" He thought about it. "Not credentials," he said. "I want people who pay attention to things nobody told them to pay attention to. People who notice." He paused. "The best security isn't the person with the most training. It's the person who can't stop watching a room even when it's their job to relax." Victoria looked at him. "People like you," she said. "People like a lot of the people already in this building," he said. "We just haven't been listening to them." It was that sentence, quiet, unperformed, spoken into an empty room on a Thursday afternoon, that Victoria Sterling would quote 7 weeks later at the company-wide meeting where she announced the full restructuring of Sterling Horizon's Security and Emergency Response Division. She would quote it in front of 412 employees, gathered in the main conference center of the rebuilt Executive Tower, standing at a podium with Daniel Cross seated in the front row, and Lily Cross sitting next to him in a chair that was slightly too big for her, wearing her good shoes, which were on her feet, and not in the middle of a doorway for once. She would quote it, and then she would say, "We've spent years building security systems that were sophisticated and expensive and completely dependent on the assumption that the most important people in this building were the ones with the most authority. Last month proved that assumption wrong. The most important person in this building on the night of the attack was a man we'd employed for 3.5 years, whose name most of us didn't know." She paused. "That changes today." The policy had already gone into effect 2 weeks earlier. The binding, enforceable 24-hour response guarantee for any safety concern reported by any employee at any level. Patricia Wynne had filed the first report under the new policy 48 hours after it was announced, a malfunctioning emergency door seal on the 14th floor that maintenance had been deferring for 6 months. It was fixed within the day. Daniel had framed the work order. Not seriously. Well, a little seriously. Lily had helped him hang it in the kitchen next to the calendar, and when he'd explained to her what it represented, she'd looked at it for a long moment and said, "So someone listened." "Yeah," he said. "Someone listened." She'd nodded at it the same way she'd nodded at the thing he'd told her about being scared and staying anyway. Like it was real and difficult and true, and therefore worth understanding completely. 3 weeks after the company meeting, Richard Vail was indicted on 47 counts, including conspiracy, financial fraud, and domestic terrorism charges related to the attack on Sterling Horizon. His attorney entered a not guilty plea. The federal prosecutor's office announced they had sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Evidence that included 8 months of Victoria Sterling's meticulous documentation, now fully intact on the off-site server she'd been quietly building since the February board meeting when she first understood the scale of what Vail had been doing. The text message from the Northern Virginia, number the one that had said, "Come home," soldier, turned out to be from a man named James Ellery, formerly of the same classified unit. Daniel had served and currently working in a capacity that Daniel understood enough about to know he wasn't going to ask for specifics. Ellery called him directly the week after the indictment. "Saw the news," Ellery said. "Most people did," Daniel said. "You look different," Ellery said. "In the photos. I'm wearing a suit." "That's not it." A pause. "You look like yourself again." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "How would you know what that looks like?" he said. "You haven't seen me in 9 years." "I know what you looked like before Kandahar," Ellery said. "And I know what you looked like after. And I've been watching the news for a week." Another pause, shorter. "It's closer to before." Daniel sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "How's Jerry?" "Jerry is fine. He's growing tomatoes in his backyard and watching too much cable news, and he cried watching the press conference about your promotion." "Tell him I said to stop crying about things." "He'll ignore you," Ellery said. He always did. A beat. Daniel, if you ever want to talk about Kandahar, with someone who was there. I know where to find you, Daniel said. Yeah, Ellery said. You do. The call ended. Daniel sat with his phone in his hand for a moment in his office. His actual office now in the rebuilt executive tower. A room with a desk and a window, and his name on the door, which still felt slightly unreal every time he walked past it. And he thought about Kandahar the way he was slowly learning to think about it. Not as an open wound, not as a sealed vault. As a real thing that had happened, that had costs that were permanent, and losses that would never be recovered. And that was part of the architecture of who he was, without being the whole building. I thought about 6 names. He said them quietly in the order he always said them. Then he put his phone in his pocket, picked up the folder for the afternoon interview. The third candidate this week for the new emergency response team, a woman named Torres, who had spent 6 years as a hospital security coordinator, and whose references described her as someone who was always the first to notice when something was off and went to work. At 5:45 p.m., he got a text from Lily. It said, I left my shoes in the doorway again. He read it twice. Then he typed back, I know. I'll trip on them when I get home. Her response came back in 4 seconds. Good, she said. Means you're coming home. Means you're... He stood up, put the folder under his arm, and walked out of his office and down the corridor toward the elevator, past the security station, where the overnight guard, a new hire. A young man named Ortega, who had come through Daniel's own interview process, and who had the specific quality of attention Daniel had described to Victoria, looked up and nodded as he passed. Not a nod of deference. A nod between colleagues. Daniel nodded back. He took the elevator down. In the lobby, he passed the cleaning crew coming in for the evening shift. 3 of them carts and equipment. The particular organized quiet of people beginning a night's work that most of the building would never see or think about. He knew their names. He'd made it his business to know their names the week he took the job, not as policy, not as performance, but because they were the people who saw the building, the way he used to see it, the way the building actually was when the powerful people weren't in it, and that visibility was worth more than most of the expensive systems the company had paid for. He stopped. The lead of the crew, a man named Oscar, 61 years old, 17 years with the company, the kind of institutional knowledge that existed nowhere in any official document looked up. Mr. Cross, Oscar said. Oscar, Daniel said. You see anything unusual this week? Anything that felt off? Oscar considered this the way a man considers something he's been thinking about without quite giving himself permission to think about it. 3rd floor mechanical room, he said. East panel's been warm. Not wrong warm, but warmer than it should be. I mentioned it to the new facilities guy. When? Daniel said. Tuesday, Oscar said. Did he follow up? Oscar's expression said everything. Daniel pulled out his phone, opened the direct line to the facilities manager, typed a message that was 3 sentences long and ended with the phrase, "Today, please not when convenient." He put the phone back. If he doesn't respond by tomorrow morning, Daniel said, call me directly. My number is in the all-staff directory now. Oscar looked at him for a moment. Not with surprise exactly, with something more careful than surprise. The look of a man who had spent 17 years in this building and was making a slow, deliberate update to a very fundamental assumption about who was paying attention. All right, Oscar said. Thank you, Daniel said, for noticing. He walked out through the lobby doors into the evening city, and for a moment he stood on the sidewalk the way he'd stood on it 3 days after the attack, letting it settle around him, the noise, the movement, the enormous indifferent momentum of a place that contained 10 million lives and moved through each of them the same way. He thought about the night, about the broken cart with its squeaking wheel, about the photograph of Lee in his jacket pocket and Hargrove's hand at his throat in the north corridor, and Patricia Wynn's grip on his hand in the empty meeting room, and Lily asking promise from across a kitchen table at 7 in the morning. He thought about the 6 names. He thought about 23. He hailed a cab. He gave the driver his address in Queens. He rode home through the evening traffic with his folder on his lap and his phone quiet in his pocket, and the particular tiredness of a man who had spent a day doing work that mattered, not the performing of importance, not the managing of impressions, but the actual ordinary essential work of paying attention to the right things and making sure the right people were heard. Lily's shoes were in the middle of the doorway, exactly where she'd said they'd be. He tripped on the left one. He stood in the entryway for a moment, one hand on the wall, looking down at the shoes. Then he left them exactly where they were. I went to the kitchen where Lily was at the table with her homework and a glass of milk and the particular focused energy of a child who had decided tonight was a homework night, and he sat across from her the way he sat every morning when he was home, and he said nothing, because nothing needed to be said, and she said nothing, because she knew it didn't. And for a little while, there was just the sound of the city outside the window, and the scratch of her pencil on paper, and the specific, unremarkable, absolutely irreplaceable ordinary of being home. At some point, she looked up. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. Are you going to be okay? Like with the new job and everything?" He looked at her across the table. At the 9-year-old who had asked him that morning if he was scared, and accepted the true answer with the steady grace of a person twice her age. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am." She looked at him for another second, with those clear eyes that had been looking at him his whole life, and seeing things he hadn't always wanted seen. Then she went back to her homework. And Daniel crossed the man. Nobody saw the man. Everyone walked past the man who had spent 9 years hiding from himself in the useful dark of a building that needed cleaning, sat at his kitchen table in Queens, and felt for the first time since Kandahar, like the space he occupied in the world was exactly the right size for who he was. Not too small, not too quiet, not a punishment, just his. Because a person's value is never decided by the uniform they wear. And the men who understand that truth most completely are always the ones who learned it the hard way.